This is a story of a young man chasing a big win, and an old stranger who taught him that lasting change comes from small, repeated things, not the big win he was chasing. There's a bench by the river in this city that nobody notices. People walk past it every day, on their phones, late for something, chasing something. But if you sat there long enough, on the right afternoon, you might meet a man who could change the way you see your entire life. This is the story of the day I did. My name doesn't matter for this story, so let's just say I was 26, and I was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. I had a job that paid the bills and drained everything else. I had a phone full of people I never called. And I had a habit, a bad one, of starting things with enormous energy and abandoning them within 2 weeks. New Year's resolutions I broke by February. Gym memberships I paid for and never used past week 3. A business idea I researched obsessively for a month and then never mentioned again. My apartment had 4 half-read books on the nightstand and 1 guitar I hadn't touched in a year, still in its case, like a promise I kept meaning to get around to. I wasn't lazy. That's the part people get wrong about someone like me. I worked hard, I just worked hard in bursts, like a fire that burns bright and dies out just as fast. I wanted the big win. The dramatic transformation. The moment where everything clicked and I became someone else entirely. I was waiting for that moment the way some people wait for a bus that was never actually coming. That afternoon, I just quit yet another attempt, this time, learning to cook properly, something I told myself for years I'd get good at. I'd made it 11 days. 11 days of actual effort, and then I burned a pan of rice so badly it set off the smoke alarm, and something in me just gave up. Not just on the rice. On the whole idea. I remember standing in my kitchen thinking, maybe I'm just not someone who finishes things. I went for a walk to clear my head, which is how I ended up at the river. And that's where I saw him, an old man, sitting alone on that bench, feeding breadcrumbs to a duck that clearly already knew him. He looked to be in his 70s, maybe older, hard to tell. He had the kind of face that seemed to have settled into permanent calm, like weather that had finally decided what kind of day it was going to be. He wore an old flannel jacket despite the warmth, and he didn't look up when I sat down a few feet away on the same bench. He just kept tossing bread, one small piece at a time, to a fat gray duck that waddled back and forth like it had done this every day for years, because, I'd later learn, it had. "You look like a man who just quit something," he said, without turning his head. I laughed, more out of surprise than amusement. "That obvious? You've got the face for it. I've seen it 1,000 times. Usually on my own reflection, a long time ago." I don't know why I told him. Maybe because he was a stranger, and strangers are easier to be honest with than people who actually know you. I told him about the rice. About the guitar. About the gym membership and the resolutions and the business idea that died in a notebook. I told him I felt like I was the kind of person who was good at starting things and terrible at being someone. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he just nodded slowly, like he was turning something over in his mind, deciding whether I was worth the trouble of an answer. "Can I tell you something about this duck?" he finally said. "This duck," he said, "showed up here 4 years ago. Skinny thing. Barely made it through that first winter, I think, on scraps and luck. I started feeding him, just once, on a whim, because I felt sorry for him. Didn't think anything of it. But I kept coming back. Same bench, same time, most afternoons. And so did he. Not because I decided one day, I am now a man who feeds a duck. I never made that decision. I just showed up the next day. And the day after. And most days after that, for 4 years. Look at him now." He gestured at the duck, plump and glossy-feathered, completely unbothered by our presence, clearly at home in this exact spot. That's not luck. That's not one big decision. That's 4 years of small, boring, unremarkable afternoons that nobody would ever put in a movie. I asked him what that had to do with me. "Everything," he said. "You're waiting for the moment you become a different person. The clean break. The switch that flips. But that's not how it works, not for ducks, not for men. You didn't fail at cooking because you're not a person who finishes things. You failed because you were trying to become someone in 11 days. Nobody becomes anyone in 11 days. You just show up, badly, for a very long time, until one day you look up and the duck is fat and you didn't even notice it happening." I sat with that for a moment. It should have sounded like every other piece of advice I'd half listened to and forgotten, the kind of thing printed on a motivational poster in an office break room. But it didn't feel like that. Maybe because of how he said it. Maybe because of the duck sitting right there as proof. "So what do?" I asked. "Just show up." Not to everything, he said. That's the mistake people make when they hear advice like this. They try to show up to 10 things at once and burn out in a week, same as you did with the resolutions. Pick one. Something small enough that missing a day feels stupid, not just hard. And then you don't even think about finishing it. You just don't miss 2 days in a row. That's the whole rule. That's the entire secret, if you want to call it that. Part of me wanted to argue. It sounded too simple, the kind of thing that's easy to say and hard to actually believe when you're the one who's failed at this exact thing a dozen times before. I told him that. I told him I'd heard versions of this advice before, in books, in videos, and none of it had ever stuck. He smiled at that, the first real smile I'd seen from him. Of course it didn't stick. You heard it. You didn't do it. There's a difference between understanding an idea and letting it change your Tuesday afternoon. He nodded toward my hands. What's something so small you'd be embarrassed to call it a goal? I thought about it. Really thought, not just reaching for the first answer. And what came to mind wasn't the guitar, or the gym, or the business idea. All the big, ambitious versions of myself I kept failing to become. It was something smaller. Stupidly small. Reading 10 pages a night, I said. Not even a chapter. Just 10 pages, before bed, instead of scrolling on my phone. That's good, he said. That's small enough that missing it feels dumb. That's exactly the size it should be. That's it? That's the whole plan? That's the whole plan. You'll want to add more. Don't. You'll want to read 50 pages the first night to prove something to yourself. Don't do that either. 10 pages. Every night. For a long time. Long past the point where it feels meaningful. That's the only part people skip, and it's the only part that matters. I asked him how he knew all this. Whether he'd read it somewhere, some book on habits or self-discipline. He shook his head. I learned it the expensive way. I ran a small hardware store for 30 years, 3 blocks from here, gone now, torn down for an apartment building. When I was about your age, I wanted to be a serious craftsman. Furniture, real woodwork, the kind of thing people pass down. I bought expensive tools. I took 1 class. I built 1 table, badly, and never touched the wood again for nearly a decade. What changed? My wife did, in a way. Not on purpose. She used to knit every single night, just 15, 20 minutes, no matter how tired she was. Never made a big deal of it. I used to tease her, gently, that it seemed pointless, doing so little each night. Then one year I noticed she'd made an entire blanket, and I hadn't seen it happen. It had just accumulated, while I wasn't paying attention, because I was too busy waiting for the big burst of motivation to build my furniture in one triumphant weekend. So I started small. 20 minutes with wood, most evenings, no pressure to finish anything grand. Some nights it was just sanding. Some nights just measuring a board I wouldn't cut for a week. It felt embarrassingly small compared to the ambitious woodworker I'd imagined becoming. He reached down and tapped the leg of the bench we were sitting on. Built this myself. 15 years ago. Nobody believes me when I tell them how, 20 minutes at a time, over about 4 months, alongside the actual duck feeding, alongside the actual life I was living. It wasn't dramatic. It was just consistent. And consistent, given enough time, starts to look a whole lot like mastery from the outside, even though it never felt like anything special while it was happening. We sat a while longer, not saying much. The duck eventually wandered off toward the water, done with us for the day. The light had shifted, that late afternoon gold that makes everything feel a little more meaningful than it probably is. Eventually he stood, slowly, with the particular care of someone whose knees have opinions about sitting on wooden benches. I come here most afternoons, he said. If you're ever back this way and you've kept your 10 pages going, I'd like to hear about it. If you haven't, well, I'd like to hear about that too. Either way's a fine reason to come sit by a river. I asked him his name, finally, embarrassed I hadn't thought to before. Doesn't matter much, he said, with something between a smile and a shrug. You won't remember the name. You'll remember the duck. And with that, he walked off down the path, unhurried, like a man with absolutely nowhere he needed to be, which, I suspect, was exactly the point. I want to tell you I went home and everything changed instantly. That would make a better story. It wouldn't be true. What actually happened is smaller than that, and slower, and far less cinematic. I read 10 pages that night. It felt almost too easy to count as anything. The next night, I nearly skipped it. I was tired, and my phone was right there, and 10 pages felt like it didn't matter enough to bother with. But I remembered what he'd said about not missing 2 nights in a row, and something about that specific rule, not never miss a day, just never miss 2 in a row, felt achievable in a way that perfect discipline never had. So I read my 10 pages, tired, unmotivated, not enjoying it much that particular night. I kept going. Some nights it was genuinely 10 pages and nothing more. I'd set a timer just to make sure I wasn't cheating myself into stopping early out of habit. Other nights I get pulled into the story and read 40 without noticing. Most nights, it was simply 10. Unremarkable. Forgettable, almost, in the moment. 4 months later, I checked, because I wanted to know, I had finished 11 books. 11. More than I'd read in the previous 3 years combined, and I hadn't spent a single night forcing myself through some heroic, unsustainable reading marathon. I hadn't even noticed it accumulating, the same way the old man said he hadn't noticed his wife's blanket, the same way he hadn't noticed the duck getting fat, the same way he apparently built an entire bench without ever feeling, on any single evening, like he was doing something impressive. It's not a dramatic transformation. I want to be honest about that, because I think dramatic transformations are mostly what get sold to us, and mostly what set people up to feel like failures when their own lives look more like mine, quiet, gradual, almost embarrassingly small in any given moment. I didn't become a different person. I became someone who reads 10 pages a night, and who, somewhere in the process, quietly became someone who finishes things, not because I decided to be that person, but because I kept showing up long past the point where it stopped feeling like a decision at all. I went back to the bench, eventually, on a Sunday afternoon almost exactly like the one where we'd first met. I brought bread, this time, bought specifically for the duck, though I felt a little foolish doing it. He wasn't there. I sat for a long while anyway, feeding the duck myself, badly, most of the bread landing in places the duck didn't seem interested in. I don't know what happened to the old man. Maybe he moved. Maybe something more permanent. I never learned his name, exactly as he predicted, and there was something fitting about that. This stranger who reshaped how I thought about my entire life in the space of one conversation, and who I couldn't have picked out of a crowd a year later if his name had been the question. But I remember the duck. I remember the bench, and I know, because I checked once, that he really had built it himself, 15 years before, 20 minutes at a time. I still read 10 pages most nights. Not every night, I've missed plenty, though never 2 in a row, not once, not since that first week. It's not a large thing, in the scheme of a life. It's not the story people usually want to hear, the one with the dramatic before and after, the single moment where everything clicked. But I think, more often than not, that's actually what most real change looks like. Small. Quiet. Almost invisible while it's happening. A duck getting fat 1 crumb at a time, until one day you look up, and it's not skinny anymore, and you can't point to the exact afternoon when that happened, only that it did, because you kept showing up. If there's a bench in your life, a habit so small you'd be embarrassed to call it a goal, I hope you find it soon. Not the big one. The small one. That's usually the one that actually works. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear about your own small habit in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, consider subscribing. I'll be back by the river soon.